Good morning. My name is Levi Sumagaisai, and I'm a tech reporter at MarketWatch. I cover technology, the economy, and equity issues. It's my pleasure to be your moderator today for the Commonwealth Club program, Technology and Race, the Role of Big Tech. I am joined by three experts on this topic, and we're here today because of the publication of a book edited by one of our speakers, Jim Steyer. Jim is the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, which has done important work on media and technology advocacy for families and kids and schools. His book is titled Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. And this program is being done in association with Common Sense Media. The book offers a collection of bold essays on how technology is affecting democracy, society, and our future. It's a valuable resource and is available where books are sold. We are joined today by two contributors to the book, Ellen Pao, who is the CEO of Project Include and a longtime advocate for diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. She joins us from the Bay Area. And we are also joined by Ted Shaw, the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina Law School. He joins us this morning from North Carolina. Before we jump into the conversation, one final note. If you have a question for any of us, please post it in the YouTube chat or the Facebook comment section, and the questions will be forwarded to me during the program. Let's jump in. I'm going to start off with a question to Ellen. We are seeing a couple of recent high-profile controversies in tech that are very germane to our topic today. One is the departure of Dr. Timnit Gebru from Google, and the other is a settlement that Pinterest reached with its former chief operating officer, Francoise Brouwer. A very quick summary, as I understand it. Dr. Gebru is a Black woman and a leading AI expert. She was writing a paper that was being questioned by Google, and she was pushing back and threatened to quit unless the company met some of her her concerns. Instead, Google said it accepted her resignation. In the case of Pinterest, two Black women and policy experts, Ifeoma Uzoma and Erica Banks, accused the company of discrimination, of not paying them fairly, and of retaliation. They shared their story publicly upon their exit. A couple of months later, the COO, who is a white woman, also accused the company of discrimination and unequal pay. She sued, and Pinterest settled with her for $20 million. The two women who quit earlier got less than a year's severance, Ifeoma confirmed to me this week. Ellen, considering your background, your longtime work in the tech industry, and the fact that your lawsuit against Kleiner Perkins several years ago helped pave the way for women to speak up about bias and discrimination in the workplace. Can you share your thoughts about this, about what's going on now, and where does Project Include fit in when it comes to these types of issues?
I'll start with the positive. I think it's great to see people speaking up. So the two women from Pinterest were also Black women, and they came out at a time when everybody, including myself, thought Pinterest was a great company to work for, that it was inclusive, that they had policies to remove anti-vax information, they had policies to remove posts that were not inclusive. And you also see Dr. Gebru, was a leader in tech. She still is, but everybody saw her. She had the PhD from Stanford. She had worked with the top researchers. She's a star, and to see like what has happened to them afterwards, in the aftermath, to see how these companies are behaving has been a real disappointment. You look at Google, and I think some of the details are kind of interesting, where it seems like this paper that Dr. Gebru was trying to have published went through a different process than other papers, where there are a set of rules, and people didn't follow the rules. But when Dr. Gebru, decided to follow the same path as every other person, or I think it was, they were data people, so they came up with a number like 59% of the people don't follow the process. She didn't follow the process exactly, apparently, and ended up getting fired for it, basically. So this, she's calling out problems and the company isn't responsive to it. I think that's a pattern that we see in tech. Only now we see that the press, folks like you, Libby, and others are now paying attention. So I think when I sued, it was hard for people to understand, because there were very few people who were calling out problems, and it seemed like tech was great. There were, this opportunity to connect people. There was this opportunity to share information, and all of that was happening in a world where where we had originally been, trying to call people from landlines, and all of a sudden you have this magic of this phone where you can do anything from it, and it was seen as a positive. And now we're starting to see where all of the negatives have been hidden by this overall image of tech as being so positive. Actually, Pinterest seemed great, but there was actually a lot of what sounds like systemic racism at the company. Google seems great. It's sharing the world's information, but actually there's a lot of racism that happens at the company, and sexism, and that's making its way into all the products. And when you call out those problems, you get fired, right? So there's a problem now. Workers are pushing against it. At Project Include, we're really pushing companies to improve their diversity and inclusion, to include people from different backgrounds at all levels of the company, to make sure that they're being heard, that they're given opportunities, and that companies are tracking it the way they would track any other business imperative. So use metrics, make sure people are being held accountable to these metrics.
We will probably come back to this issue. Hopefully we will have a little bit more time a little bit later. I wanted to turn to Professor Shaw. In your essay in Jim's book, you write about how technological advances like mobile phones and social media are helping bring racism to light. Including, of course, most famously this year, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. On the one hand, it's a positive thing that we have this technology that helps bring racism to light. On the other hand, you also write that some of this technology has helped make racial inequality worse. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe talk about some of the most egregious examples?
Sure. First, let me say I'm honored to be part of this conversation and this discussion. And my longtime friend, Jim Steyer, wrote me into this. And so there it is.
There it is.
I was thinking about the fact that the experience of African Americans, in particular in this country, has been now 400 years in length. And for decades and decades, even longer than that, back in the earlier centuries, African Americans have been subjected to violence at the hands of the law, sanctioned by law. In the era of slavery, slave patrols, the violence of slave masters, as they were called then. But even in the 20th century, a good deal of violence by police leveled against unarmed Black people, mostly, but not exclusively men. And of course, there was private violence also, the era of lynchings. Then it comes into the 21st century with us. of course, a lot of this violence was denied. There was this gaslighting that went on regularly. But then we have everybody now has these cell phones. And when they witness, the police interacting with people of color, people like George Floyd, who lost his life, or even looking back at some of the other instances that have gotten a lot of attention recently, there's videotape. You can't deny what you see, except that, of course, in many instances, those responsible for these actions tell you aren't seeing what you see and try to explain it away. Technology has made a tremendous difference. I don't know that we can credit the tech companies for specifically intending to have that happen. They were creating a product that's universally used now. But that's a good thing, I think, in many respects. On the other hand, the industry itself is an industry in which there's huge amounts of money being made by an almost exclusively white club. And mostly men. And like almost every other industry in this country, these industries have had more than their share of racial discrimination in terms of who gets to be part of that club, both with respect to race and ethnicity, but also gender. And so that's where these companies come up short, even while they're producing products that have helped to shine a light on racial discrimination, violence at the hands of the police, inequity, et cetera. It's a great irony. And so that's what I was trying to speak to. I have strongly mixed feelings about what we see, we being African Americans, but if I don't want to be presumptuous and speak about others, but collectively what we see with respect to the utility of these products in terms of being tools to get at racial injustice, and yet at the same time, the industry itself having its own share of racial injustice.
Right. Along those same lines, Jim, part 5 of your book is about technology and race. The first essay in that chapter is about algorithmic bias, and it's actually titled The New Jim Code.
Right.
Yeah, can you discuss, how algorithms can perpetuate racism and reflect our society, and, what needs to be done about it?
Sure. I mean, first of all, thanks, Levy, and it's great to be here with Ted and Ellen. This is a big deal. Look, just to summarize, to reinforce what they said, one, the tech industry is incredibly white and male. I actually think, since we know Ellen, I'm thinking about, it's really interesting that Google is getting hammered here, right? Because of all the big companies, in a funny way, they have more women at the top now who literally have important positions there, right? And Sundar is a person of color, the CEO, right? So in my opinion, Google has come a long way since the days of Eric Schmidt as CEO. And we could have a discussion about that. I'll look at it, Ellen, because we could tell a lot of stories about that. And by the way, they've had a lot of problems on both gender and race issues before. But I actually think it's interesting that Dr. Jabbrouk comes out of Google, a company that on both the has tried to do something. But basically, as Ted and Ellen said, it's a white male industry, just like Hollywood. I mean, it's really interesting because the two big media industries, the tech industry and the media industry, and they're increasingly merging, are incredibly dominated by white men, period. And the chickens are coming home to roost now in 2020 and 2021. So that's number one. And to your point about algorithms, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and this is picking up on what Teddy is saying, is like we started this effort called Stop Hate for Profit about a year ago with the ADL and some of the big civil rights organizations in the United States, the NAA, Color of Change, et cetera. Basically because Facebook and Instagram and some of the other social media platforms are constantly amplifying racist hate messages. And so algorithms, basically the algorithmic systems that drive Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, et cetera, basically in many cases appeal to the lowest common denominator, are driven by anger, hate. If you want to get a lot of clicks, if you want to feed the algorithm, if you will, extremist points of view, racist, white supremacist points of view are amplified incredibly by the algorithms. That is a huge problem that Silicon Valley has ignored. And Common Sense Media has led this discussion over the last couple of years. We really broke through in 2020 with our Stop Hate for Profit campaign that we did with the ADL and NAA, et cetera. But it's a huge problem. They've completely ignored that issue now for years. And again, it's largely the social media platforms. And Google owns YouTube, by the way. Google owns YouTube. So you've seen massive disinformation, massive misinformation, election hacking, basic constitutional norms being attacked, but by the way, amplified by the algorithm, but then also racist, hateful messages, images, all algorithmically driven. So this is a fundamental problem. The industry has to address it, but so does the federal government. And I actually think I'm optimistic you're going to see major changes in the year ahead. And sad to say, even this incident with the doctor at Google may just reinforce to the world the problems that exist and how they have to be taken care of.
And that actually is a great segue into my next question, which is for Ellen, who has been CEO of Reddit and definitely knows about all the moderation issues that you mentioned. Technology has emboldened people to be as hateful as they want to be. And as we know, that kind of hatred and that vitriol falls disproportionately to women and to people of color.
Right.
Ellen, can you talk about, based on your experience at Reddit, of course, can you talk about all this? And also, do you think tech companies are starting to do better? You're on mute.
I'll start with the last question. I think tech companies want to let people believe that they're doing better, but they actually are not. I think the piece that people don't understand is it's actually not that hard to get rid of the bad content on the systems. You set a bunch of rules. There aren't that many bad actors, and most people will fall in line with the rules. But if your rules are fuzzy, people will try to take advantage of them, and they will try to push that line, and they will try, and if they know they might have a chance of their content getting through, they're going to try it. And you're going to end up with so much, and it's going to keep growing because people are saying that's what's working. That's what the algorithms are driving people to. They're driving people to hate. They're driving people to disinformation. They're driving people to extremism. So that part of it, I think, is not improving at all. And as these things scale, it's just becoming bigger and bigger problems. And you're seeing, it's causing genocide. It's causing an election that was won, many say was won after influenced by the Russians. It's causing, people to threaten our secretaries of state who are running the election, right? It's causing more real life damage. And I think that's the piece that people need to be paying attention to. I think I think one of the things that Dr. Gebru was trying to point out with her research is that, we're basing all these algorithms on really bad data, right? This data that's filled with, with bias, where there's a lot of information that's only based on, the white men who created it. Reddit at the beginning, the data was very oriented around people who are white and male because that was most of the user base. And then that became very hateful and very harassing. And, there was a period where I was harassed severely, and all of that data is being used by these big companies and data sets to create algorithms on what to show people and, how to encourage people to behave and to experience. So there's this, so it's all tied together where, this fact that we've got this very homogenous group of people building products and they can't understand these problems means these problems proliferate. And as these technology companies gain more power and influence, they scale and they're getting worse and they're not getting better. And the people who are trying to call attention to these problems are being pushed out, right? So I do.
If you and Teddy, let me just say this to you guys. If we sat here and said, we're going to start a company that's going to undermine the norms of democracy, let a bunch of white supremacists crawl out from under the rocks that they've been living under and never, right? And we're a tiny, outspoken group of people, but allow them to form groups on our platform and multiply 100-fold or 1,000,000-fold. And then we were going to also promote some of the most virulent, racist, disgusting messages possible and make a lot of money at that. If we announced that we're going to have a company that did that, right? You would imagine the outrage that people would feel, but that's exactly what's happened. And the idea, and by the way, we all know the companies, so they're all different, and a lot of it depends on who the leadership of the companies are. That's why I pointed out Sundar and Ruth and the people who actually run Google now, who I actually respect. So I'm sure there's not a happy time for Sundar Pichai having to deal with all this. He's been dealing with a legacy of a lot of issues that we all know about from the early days at Google. But the thing is, if you just announced you're going to do a company like that was going to be one of the most powerful, richest companies in the world, you would think of the outrage. But that's exactly what's happened. And the fact that we're not outraged as a society about this, if we've watched what's happened to our country, to people's lives, is shocking to me. And that's why, by the way, thank you for plugging the book, Teddy. But that's why it's which side of history? Because the point is, which side of history do these guys want to be on? Because how do you want your reputation to be? You were really rich and you had 50 mansions and a Boeing 747 private plane, but you also undermined democracy, destroyed people's lives, allowed for incredible racism, hatred, death. That's what these companies have to deal with. So to me, forcing this discussion and then having leading folks of color like Ted and Ellen and all sorts of other people come out and hold them accountable is critical. I mean, this is a huge moment, I think, for our society to deal with this stuff. They're literally undermining the norms of democracy that we all grew up and took for granted, and a lot of other things. How can we not be outraged by that?
Right. I think probably the key is, are enough of us outraged, right? And are the right people outraged, the people who are in a position to do something about it? I want to turn to Professor Shaw. I report a lot about the future of work, the app-based, on-demand gig economy was built off the labor of low-wage workers who are mostly Black and brown.
The gig economy or the new gig economy, as it's called, is something that I think replicates the old gig economy in some ways, and in some ways it doesn't. If I understand what it is, I welcome engagement and make sure I understand it correctly. But when I hear the term, it's temporary workers with or in temporary arrangements. In this economy and in the tech world, that can be an economy, and it can include workers that actually do pretty well, make a good amount of money. On the other hand, it may replicate the old gig economy with respect to who gets left in, who is out, who has jobs that are more marginalized jobs, who has jobs that are more central, and even though they're temporary, the fact that those jobs are going to have a permanence as part of the economy gives people the opportunity to be players, et cetera. But I think that the new gig economy is one that is ripe with opportunities to continue marginalizing people of color in that economy and excluding them from the real tech economy, or at least I should say the most lucrative parts of the tech economy. So in some ways it's new, in some ways it isn't.
Yeah, right. Do you want to jump in there, Ellen? Yeah.
If you don't mind, I think the interesting part is a lot of these jobs are going to go away, right? So now you've got these companies spending billions of dollars trying to automate driving.
Right.
All of them, so that they can get rid of the gig workers. You've got, the drones that Amazon's trying to build to deliver food, to deliver all these products. So then you won't have the people who are delivering food in these other gig economies. It's one where these people are seen as expendable. They're not seen as workers. We just saw these companies spend $200 million to prevent their workers from being classified as workers, so they won't have employee rights and they won't have health benefits. So it's a temporary job in the long-term sense of the word too, because they don't want these employees. They don't want them to be working for them. They want to replace them with automation.
And Ellen, just to pick up on that point and what you and Ted are saying is, as a Stanford professor, right? You didn't introduce me as a Stanford professor, but that is what I've been for.
Sorry, Jim.
For 34 years. So I have a lot of these guys as my students. They should have spent more time in my civil rights class that Teddy lectures in a lot. And I'm being serious because let me make the point. I actually think when you think about what Ellen and Ted are saying, it's that they're blind to the consequences of their behavior. I mean, if you're talking about the racism, you get a bunch of nerd engineers with somewhat of a libertarian ethos in Silicon Valley. And I'm speaking to, that's why I brought up being a Stanford professor, because these kids are all my students, even though they're taking civil rights and civil liberties from me and listening to Professor Shaw talk about the 14th Amendment. Then they go off and they take a job at Google or Facebook or Reddit or wherever they go, right? As engineers. And a lot of them, all they ever did other than that one class, they took computer science classes and engineering classes, et cetera. And they have a sort of a blinders on mentality. And I'm thinking about the guys who started these companies. Most of the people you referred to went to Stanford in some way. Sundar did, Ruth's a board member. The Dr. Jabru is a PhD from there. Zuckerberg, he just hires everybody he can out of Stanford. So, and as a professor there, I would say this, a lot of the kids who then go on to make tons of money in these companies, and this is also the companies that you're referring to, that Ellen referred to, who spent $200 million denying benefit to win the ballot initiative so they wouldn't have to treat the gig workers as regular employees. They're just blind. I don't think they're necessarily bad people. They just ignore the consequences. They have sort of this tech blinder mentality, whether it's building an algorithm or building a new platform or whatever. And they just sort of ignore the consequences of what we're doing. And now look what we have. That is what I think has happened. We're at this moment of reckoning. And that's why I said what side of history do these people want to be on? They've destroyed a lot of things that really are good in our society, and they've not taken responsibility for it. And now they're belatedly being held accountable. And they're the largest companies in the history of the world. So they have more power and more economic might than anybody since the great railroad barons of the 19th century. And I think probably bigger than them. And they're unaccountable. The government's been missing, federal government's been missing in action. But a lot of it is unintended consequences by a bunch of libertarian-oriented engineers who just wanted to move fast and break things. That's exactly what Facebook, that was Mark's mantra. Google did the same thing. And again, I like some of the people involved. Some of them are my friends and I respect them, but I'm like, do you even think through the consequences of what you're doing? Think of the issues we're talking about, putting people out of work, undermining the Constitution, hammering people for being black or brown or a woman. And you're building companies that actually do lead to that. They have to take responsibility and they have to be held to account.
And so that goes back, I think, to the question that we started with, which was, despite all the diversity initiatives that these companies have, rolled out throughout the years, these types of issues, discrimination, bias, the marginalization of Black and brown people are still happening. So what will change? I am working on a story right now, and some of the people I've talked to have said, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take internal work and external pressure. Can you talk about, Ellen, maybe, can you talk about what, beside, Project Include is one of the organizations that's trying to do something. What else will it take?
I think it's more the external pressure, and then the internal pressure is not coming from the top, it's coming from the bottom. So it's really having the press, having the public push companies to do better, and having employees share all the information about what is actually going on behind the scenes. I think, it goes back to what Jim was saying, like they don't understand the history. And when I read, I read Teddy's article or essay, and it's like, this happened in slavery, right? Where all of a sudden Black people were didn't have employment, and you're pushing a whole segment out of the economy. And this is happening again. Again, it's mostly Black and brown people who are in these jobs, and you're pushing them out. What is actually going to happen to them? And do you have, a sense of like how sociology works, how history has pushed these people out, economics, like, do you understand the systems at work here? And I a lot of these people didn't go to college, they didn't finish college, or they apparently they didn't pay attention in Jim's class, right? These are really important issues that they haven't been called to account for. They haven't been held accountable for. I think we need to keep pushing. We saw a lot of talk by Google in June, July, August about Black Lives Mattering. But then when push comes to shove and, they have a situation where you have an internal person calling out racism, calling out bad data and bad data practices within your organization, you push them out as soon as you can while they're on vacation, without even telling them, by telling their direct reports, right? And without even telling their manager. I mean, it's like, you can't even imagine this happening at a small startup, much less a huge company like Google with all of these structures. It's, that desire not to deal with these problems. I'd love to say something nice about it, and I want to believe that I care about it. But when it actually comes time to do the work, to take action, I'm not there. And that gap is something that people need to continue to push on. I hope companies do a better job of using metrics, right? Like, where are we? How much, what programs are we doing, and are they working? Instead of, we've made this 0.1% change in the number of Black employees that we have in engineering, and we need to do better, right? Like, we've heard that for year after year after year. It took, Jesse Jackson pushing Google to actually share the numbers, and also Tracy Chow pushing all the companies to share their numbers by having employees go into a database and start sharing the numbers outside of the corporate avenues. I think that's what's going to happen. Like, more employees are going to push for it, more organizations, more efforts like Stop the Hate. Like, those are the things that are going to push the companies. They are not structured. They are not rewarded for doing it themselves. And I don't think they understand the problems. There are not enough Black and brown people in the highest levels to actually share these problems and to explain why they're important, and to, push on the history of where these changes have led to in the past, and, where the direction of the company is taking, their customers and taking society. It's just not there. And as Jim said, like, they just don't get it.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience, and any of you, please feel free to speak up about this. We were talking about moderation issues, the hatred and the animus that comes online from all directions, and the things that tech companies are trying to do about it. Someone wants to know, what about the First Amendment concerns that surround all this?
Okay, let me teach him Con Law 101 for your questioner. Teddy, if I miss it, Professor Shaw can come back in since he teaches this too.
Where you go?
Okay, the First Amendment applies to government restriction on speech, okay? So last time I checked, this has nothing to do, but by the way, with the government restricting speech. This is all about corporate responsibility, or the lack thereof. Okay, so I'm responsible for what's on the Common Sense Media platform. We have about 150 million users. Okay, so if they don't like what's on there, it's not like the government is regulating what's on there. It's the editors and the people who work for us. And I'm ultimately responsible in the same way Susan Wojcicki and Sundar and those guys are responsible for what's on YouTube, or Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg are responsible for what's on Facebook or Instagram. So the conflation of the First Amendment protections of free speech with this issue is bogus. And by the way, the tech industry has spent 10 years or more trying to cloud and muddy the waters by trying to conflate their deep belief in free speech, which is in many cases just phony BS, with their business practices of how they run the companies and don't do moderation. So this is not a First Amendment issue. This would be a First Amendment issue if the government was restricting specifically what was on those platforms, but they're not. The issue is, do they moderate the content on their platforms? Why have they allowed virulent racist white supremacists to crawl out from under the rocks they used to live under and organize groups on Facebook and then build massive QAnon conspiracies across the web? Why? Because they're not responsible. Could they have moderated that? Absolutely. They're trillion-dollar companies. The excuses are boring at this point. They just don't do it because they're coining money off of the basic practice. Number one, they're coining money. Number two, they don't get it. And Ellen, I actually think that's the way to say it, Teddy. They just don't get it and they don't care enough. And Ellen and Teddy are right. It's going to have to come from pressure on the employees themselves. They should be outraged. We've been asking the Facebook guys and Stop Pay for Profit, the employees, how do you feel about your company? You feel proud when you look in the mirror in the morning and think about what you're going to do at your job, right? Okay, let's see what we're going to do today. We're going to undermine democracy. We're going to spread some white supremacy around the world. We're going to help genocide in Myanmar. And by the way, we're going to do some other stuff too, but I'm going to participate in all those things. This has got to be pressure. And Ted, I'd be interested in you, since we both come out of the civil rights world and you spent basically your entire career there. I think it's time. I mean, you mentioned Jesse Jackson, but don't you think we need a lot more pressure from some of the major civil rights organizations and gender rights and women's organizations in the country, really pounding these guys over a period of time? Because I do think the pressure, Ellen is right. I think the pressure is going to have to come from the bottom and the top, and because you cover it, Levy, and because they feel the pressure. But I don't know. Teddy, what do you think?
Well, I know that. It's been quite a few years since I left the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, although I'm still close to it. But I know that civil rights organizations, Legal Defense Fund and others, have in fact been very critical of these companies and have put pressure on Facebook and other companies with respect to these issues and related issues. So it's not like it doesn't happen. The money these companies are making, as you correctly point out, is mind-boggling for people like me who don't live in that world. The idea that people make the kind of money that they do is difficult to comprehend. And in some ways, when there's so much money that they're making, they're willing to kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth and criticize the devil, but live with the devil at the same time. So the other thing I'm thinking is that some of the people who have started these companies, who run these companies, these are pretty young people. This is another generation of people. They don't see themselves as part of the generation that really had to deal with and confront racism and racial discrimination. So they just don't see it. Now it's there, but they don't see it. I don't know if it's sometimes they don't choose to see it, but that's in part what structural racism is all about.
Correct.
It's baked into institutions in ways that individuals can say, I didn't do it, or, this is not the era of segregation. And they don't see the need for them to address these issues in a very aggressive and forthright ways.
And you can't ignore the political context, too. Look, we had an occupant of the Oval Office for the last 4 years openly pushing white supremacist viewpoint. He's arguing today to block the defense bill because he doesn't want to get rid of the names of Confederate generals things. I mean, you got to remember the political context. But I think, Teddy, that's so right. And Ellen, you know it, too. I mean, you got all these, that's why I brought up the Stanford experience. You got all these young kids, all they did was take computer science classes. They sort of failed to even walk over to the other side of the quad at Stanford and recognize there was a sociology department, a political science department, a history department, et cetera, et cetera. And then they just they assume a lot of stuff. They're making so much money. They're living in a little bubble. They pay off a little people here or there. They make a little nonprofit contribution to make themselves feel good, and they try to say all the right things. It's a systemic structural issue. It's basically what's coming to the fore. I think what came to the fore in 2020, what a bizarre year we've all been through. But these issues were forced out because of Ted said earlier about the racism in the George Floyd incident in the aftermath, and technology enabled us to see George Floyd be murdered. and all these other murders that have happened of unarmed Black men in particular. But this is a reckoning for society because it's systemic and structural. By the way, I think it's true within the companies. And I actually am optimistic if we really keep up the pressure that at least some of the companies will do some stuff to change. And the irony for me is because we started with Google is I actually think of the big ones. Google, at least now with the leadership, I'm really interested to see what's going to happen, what Sundar is going to do. They're in real trouble with this firing, right? They obviously are in big trouble, right? About firing. I'm really interested to see if they're going to, they're really in I'm glad I'm not having to resolve those HR issues, but they're in real trouble. But it's also because there's a disconnect, I think, probably between some of the folks. It's a really interesting time, but we need to keep up the pressure. That's the bottom line, in my opinion.
Yeah, a couple of lawmakers have written to Google and asked them what's going on, and they want answers. And again, that goes back to what we were talking about, the external pressure that has to happen for a company, for there to be real change. I wanted to ask any of you what you think about the push to either make changes to or to get rid of Section 230.
You guys go first. I'm going to say something, but you guys go first.
I'll say
I'm definitely going to say something.
At Reddit, it started as a bastion of free speech, where the founders were all about free speech, First Amendment, but more, I think, as Jim said, as a way of not having to moderate, as a way of having a cheap cost, because I'm letting everything on the platform, so I don't have to do anything. It's inertia. The less I have to do, the cheaper it is, and the easier my job is, and that's what I'm going to do. Once it became clear that, what a free-for-all leads to is the loudest voices take over, right? And that's usually the bad actor. So we had a reckoning in 2014 where our platform got taken over by stolen nude pictures of celebrities, right? Everybody else took them down, but we were this bastion of free speech, so we left them up. And so everybody was going to find these nude pictures, and we didn't have the ability to even keep up all the other parts of our site. So what happens when you have a free-for-all is like the loudest voices win, and they drive off all the other content and all the other people. So that piece, I feel, is really important to remember. Like, the consequences of these actions, it's not just, hey, I'm going to throw out this free speech thing because it's easy. It's really like what happens when people do it. It becomes a mess, and the bad actors win. When it comes to Section 230, at Reddit, we were very clear, we're not going to host content. We're not going to host video. We're not going to host photos, because then Section 230 will apply, and we don't want to be won't apply. We won't have the safe harbor. So we're not going to take those actions. Now they've taken the actions, right? The safe harbor doesn't apply. They should be regulated. They should be held liable for the content that they provide. I mean, I think Section 230 actually shouldn't be applied to these companies today. And the fact that we're having these conversations is kind of is a positive for them, because we're assuming that it does, but actually it should not. They should be fully held liable for the harm that their platforms contain and perpetuate. And I think that's a change that will force them to really think about putting in some real rules and putting in some meat to those rules.
100% agree. I have my piece in the book that I wrote, other than the introduction, I wrote with Bruce Reed, who's in the inner circle of President Biden. He's his former chief of staff. He's one of the key inner circle now for president in the Biden administration. And we wrote a piece called Why Section 230 Hurts Kids and What to Do About It. So Bruce and I in particular, we've been talking to a bunch of tone deaf senators on both sides of the aisle for the last 4 years, telling them to get rid of Section 230, that it's ridiculous, that it was written in 1996, that the original intent of the Communications Decency Act and this provision of the 1996, 25 years ago, Communications Decency Act was to protect little companies starting up. And now you have the biggest publishers in the world, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, hiding behind this provision. So we completely call for the fundamental overhaul of the provision. And because it's terrible from a kid's standpoint, because all the bad content they're exposed to on social media platforms and other platforms. These guys are the biggest publishers in the world. They should be held strictly to account for that in the same way that, Marketplace is. Come on. And so NPR is, and any radio station or television station or newspaper is. These are the big, Facebook's got more members than Christianity. They're the biggest publisher out there. They should totally be held accountable for what's on their platforms, and they can afford all the moderation. And if they're not, they should be able to be sued for all the damage and harm that they cause, like any other publisher can be. So 230 is an anachronism. It's completely out of date. The federal government was completely missing in action. And now you have the irony of people on both sides of the aisle finally calling for the overhaul or the abolition of Section 230. They're coming from totally different ideological perspectives, but it's actually healthy. And I think you're going to see a fundamental overhaul in 2021, 2022. Common Sense is the leading group in the country on this issue. You can write a much more thoughtful way to hold these companies accountable and to require moderation, et cetera. And this should be coming, but the tech companies are going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to oppose our efforts. I guarantee that. They'll try to make it look good, and they'll make up a bunch of they'll create nonprofits that say for the protection of free speech or mom and apple pie or whatever they call them. But my guess is we're going to have a big battle with the tech industry, and we're going to win. And 230 will be fundamentally overhauled within the next year to 2 years. And we may do, just like we wrote the California privacy laws because he couldn't get the federal government to do it, we might run some laws in California this year that'll also take a shot at the immunity, the safe harbor that Section 230 has provided these companies, because it shouldn't be there, period.
Yeah, so that sort of answers a question that came in from the audience, which was, can the states do anything?
Yes, but it's not the federal government has to act on 230. It's federal legislation.
Right.
But like privacy, you can do California alone can have a huge impact on some of these issues because the companies are based there.
I want to go back quickly to the moderation issue and a question for Ellen from the audience. They ask, do you think the threats against women online weren't taken seriously enough early on?
Yes, I think it wasn't experienced by the people who are leading those platforms. And it's not just women online, but the women of color had it worst, especially the Black women. I think transgender people had a lot of hard harassment to deal with. And I think it comes from the fact that these were white men who were running these platforms. They didn't get the feedback. They didn't see it. It was working great for them. They were getting all sorts of attention. They were getting all sorts of power and influence from their position within these communities and within the overall tech ecosystem. It was working for them. And because of that, they did not pay attention to what was happening to other people. And also they weren't in proximity to people who were experiencing this harm. Like you look at platforms where, Nextdoor in the early days, it was clear they weren't in proximity to the Black people who were facing all of this, being called out for being, and to, have a neighborhood watch on somebody who was walking down the street while Black. It wasn't in their friends' experiences because they never heard about it, and it continued to proliferate on the platform. It still does. I don't know, how the world would be if there had been more Black and brown people, more women starting these companies and running them. But then that goes back to venture capital being extremely problematic, being even more insular, being even more homogenous, and funding the people that they wanted to see as the next Mark Zuckerberg or that white male nerd that made them comfortable and that they thought was going to lead the way.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's where Project Include and other organizations such as yours and venture capital that invests in minority founders. That's where all that comes in. Any optimism on that part about the rise of the number of outfits like that are around now?
I'm excited because I think they will be successful. I think there's an opportunity like that Black and brown funders, that especially Black and brown women founders, are underfunded, and they're creating these great companies. They're creating these great products and services, and they will be successful. And the fact that, that the mainstream, quote unquote, venture capital industry ignores them for the most part means there is this huge kind of arbitrage opportunity for other investors to fund those founders and to make huge returns. So I'm optimistic that, that those, it's still a small fragment, a small fraction, a small percentage of the overall VC industry, but I think they will have outsized returns. I think they will be more successful, and that will, kind of start changing the mindset of the rest of the industry, and hopefully there'll be more people following them, and it will become a more fair environment.
Hey, Ted, are you optimistic about dealing with structural racism in the next year or two? Do you think the country will? Not just the industry, but
I have to be, not because it's justified, but because the alternative is unpalatable. And just as we've seen in this year, in this, I don't know what to say about this year, but we've seen so much that we haven't seen before. But among the things we've seen is a higher consciousness on the part of a lot of people, and particularly on a lot of white people. How long it lasts, I don't know. I was just thinking about the fact that these platforms, these big platforms, they have so much dominance that it's hard for people to vote with their feet and say that they have these racist and misogynist rabbit holes that they maintain. And so we're going to go elsewhere. But ultimately, I think people are going to have to make those kinds of choices to bring some pressure on these companies. Am I optimistic? Cautiously, because as I say, it's unpalatable to be despairing about this kind of stuff. We have to keep fighting.
Sort of along that same line, Professor Shaw, there's a question for you from the audience. Where do you think people interested in change should focus their energy? And does history tell us, what may be most effective?
Oh, I think, I don't know that I can point to one or two fronts. I think we have to fight on all fronts. Certainly, there's a place for, legal pressures, but the marketplace ultimately is going to have the most impact, I think, on these companies. And I hope that people organize to put pressure through the marketplace on these companies and to force change. I also think that we may see, we're beginning to see it already, but we may see in this next administration some pressure to kind of break up some of the monopolistic aspects of some of these companies.
I agree with Teddy. I was about to say that actually, Levy, that I actually think you got to look at the size and the dominance now of a handful of companies. And, we push the Facebook antitrust case with the state AGs and the FTC. We can now say it publicly. We've been working on it for the last year and a half behind the scenes. So we're really happy to see them bring this case. I actually think you need all the weapons in your arsenal. And the big thing is knowing some of the people in the inner circle in the Biden administration. We all do. And a couple of them worked at Common Sense Media recently, and one is a founding board member, Susan Rice, who I thought was going to be Secretary of State, but now she's going to be a strong chief domestic policy advisor. And she's a founding board member of Common Sense and really smart, and was a history major at Stanford, not a computer science major at Stanford. But I think these guys, I actually think this administration has a unique opportunity, but that you're still going to, I'm always optimistic. I couldn't work for kids if I weren't optimistic, but I think that you're going to see a big push in the next couple of years. And by the way, 230 is getting hammered. Look, Trump called for the abolition of 230. And so have, right-wing senators. I think it's fair to call Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton right-wing. And They have called for it. So it's interesting because I think
For entirely different reasons.
for very different reasons, but But here's the thing: is like it's interesting. So I think a lot of this is going to come to a head, but I still think you got to have the public pressure. And also, when Ellen, every time I appear with Ellen on anything, I have so much. I always want to mention my personal respect for her personal courage, speaking out as a woman in Silicon Valley against the most powerful venture capital firm in the history of Silicon Valley.
2012.
That's a huge deal. And Teddy, who spent his whole life doing civil rights litigation and advocacy, we're going to have to keep the important organizations are going to have to speak up. Common Sense Project include the Legal Defense Fund, where Ted and I work together, are going to have to be in there. But the public the country is going to have, and society writ large, because I think it's a global issue, by the way. This is not just an American issue. People are going to really have to speak up. And I'm optimistic that can happen. But the antitrust issues Ted raised are key, because the bigness makes things impervious. It made Facebook like impervious to pressure. So they ought to be in their case. I totally think that company should be broken up, and that will help.
Jim, I add one thing. It's important. I'm glad for the change that we're about to see in terms of Washington, D.C., the White House, et cetera. But we know, those of us who have been around the block for a long time know, even when people we're more sympathetic to, or our friends or people who have been colleagues go into government, we have to keep pressure on the government. It's a different kind of relationship than it's going to be with this the Trump administration, but it still has to be a relationship in which there's some healthy tensions.
Totally agree with you.
So we have about 5 minutes to go, and I wanted to touch on something that we haven't talked about so far, and that is that another essay in the book, Jim, talks about the digital divide.
Right.
And in my reporting, especially during this pandemic, I've talked with students who have had to share laptops with their parents or their siblings. I've talked to teachers who have missed some of the students who used to attend class regularly because those students do not have internet access at their homes.
Right.
And this is in Oakland. This is like, in the Bay Area. I'm not talking about, and of course the problems are worse in rural communities. Right. So let's talk about, what needs to be done on this front. Can big tech do anything? Should they do anything? I know that some of them are sort of contributing to some of these things, but let's talk about what that looks like, because the kids who can't get online now are the kids who will not be able to go and be, an engineer in the future.
Correct. Levy, no question. I mean, and look, we're the leading advocacy group in the country on the digital divide issue, Common Sense. We get this, and it's eminently closable. We just came out with a report this summer. 17 million children, 17 million kids in the United States suffer from the digital divide, meaning they don't have either the adequate devices or connectivity. I have a 16-year-old downstairs right now doing his class online, his math class right now. I hope he's doing his math class. He better be. But the point is, and he has his own laptop and he's got plenty of connectivity and blah, blah, blah. But 17 million kids do not. It's simply a matter of money. Let me be very blunt with you. It could have been solved in the stimulus package. You're going to see about 3 or 4 billion. And the latest that we've seen in the stimulus package is 3 or 4 billion. It's eminently solvable. But the government has the primary responsibility. You got to remember the chairman of the FCC under Trump, Ajit Pai was terrible, disgrace. He will go down in history in infamy for his failure to do anything about the digital divide. He should be ashamed of himself. This is eminent. This gets closable in the first half of 2021. You just need money. Do the tech companies matter? Of course they do. They should be providing, look, everybody lives on Chromebooks now. Google has undersold the market. So all the school kids use Chromebooks, and the teachers do too. And because they cost so much less than iPads. So basically, Google has a role to play, but it's really the federal government. And this is just the failure of the federal and state government, because my brother was the head of the Economic Recovery Task Force here in California. And for the problem was there was no concerted effort to do it. But the digital divide is eminently solvable. And by the way, it's number one, it's kids, and it's going to have to do with all the learning loss people have suffered in the last 9 months. It's an enormous, we're really going to have to pay the piper for that. But the other issues are, it affects all adults. If you're an adult, there's telemedicine that you can't have access to. There's all the online benefits, all the social programs that you have to now use a computer to do. So it's a fundamental equality issue in America. And again, who are the biggest losers? Black and brown, low-income families and communities and rural people. But it's a no-brainer. It's cost $10, $11 billion to solve. They gave rich people a tax cut for several $100 billion in 2018. That for a fraction of that, they could have solved the digital divide. So this is just a matter of public will. But I think that one will get done this. I think that'll get done this year, Levy. And then you have to do the implementation. But we did this around wiring every classroom in the country a few years ago. And I'm absolutely confident that can be solved. You just have to stop the obstinance of Mitch McConnell. Basically, the guy who blocked it recently is McConnell. You should know, but I'm happy to say that publicly. Shame on him for doing that. He's blocked a lot of things, by the way, that would have been good for our country. But this one is a no-brainer, and it should get solved in 2021. And most of the implementation, whether it's in rural areas or low-income urban areas, all you just need is money. And then the tech companies have a role, and they should be lobbying for it. But it's really more of a federal and state government solution. It's eminently solvable.
So final question for, Ellen and Professor Shah as well. Where should we focus our attention as the next administration comes in and tries to work on some of the problems that have really been laid bare during this crazy year that we've had? Professor Shah, you want to go first?
Well, what do we do with this new administration coming in? In almost every area I can think about, we're going to have to rebuild institutions. We're going to have to reestablish good norms. We're going to have to assess the damage that's been done over the last 4 years before we can even begin to lay out an agenda. And the problem is that administrations that are most successful have to hit the ground running. They have to know. But I think, unfortunately, there's a lot that won't be known until people get inside these governmental departments, agencies, these institutions, et cetera. But I do think, to go back to what we were talking about, we're going to have to reassess, the role of these huge platforms, these companies, and make an assessment about what is healthy for our nation and what's not. And then, channel that into public policy.
And Ellen, last word.
I think the big part is, getting the order of priorities right. And we've got, 17 million kids who aren't having a fair school experience. We've got 8 million people who are unemployed during this crisis. We've got people, you look at the food bank lines and they're, people waiting for hours just to have a meal, like kind of getting those basics, like everybody should be able to go to school. Everybody should be able to be fed. Everybody should have a place to live. And then moving to, all right, like how do we kind of get back to a common sense of decency, a common sense of, what values we stand for, a common sense of what democracy means, and, and then like roll that into how we regulate technology, how we regulate the entertainment industry. It is a lot to roll back. We're at a point where you're not allowed to teach diversity and inclusion in the federal government or in educational institutions. So how do you get back to the sense that like diversity and inclusion matter? Like we have this history of treating people horribly and we can't repeat it. And we need to make sure that we teach people. And that goes back to like, which side of history do you want to be on? Like these essays in this book really cover the whole gamut. And those are the issues that we really need to focus on. Like, how do we make sure that we live in a world where we have so much. How do we make sure that it's fairly distributed?
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today's program. Thank you to Jim and Ted and Ellen for this really important and lively discussion. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club and Common Sense Media for putting this together. The club will soon be posting this video at commonwealthclub.org. Thank you to Jim Steyer. Remember to check out his book, Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. I am Levi Sumagaisai, and this Commonwealth Club program is now concluded. Thank you, everyone.